Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where I talk about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Van Helsing. A lot of interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, let's pick up with Axel and Julius. Obviously, Axel wakes up inside a facility and finds Doc working on Julius because Julius is kind of, I guess because of the wounds he sustained, he ended up absorbing a lot more of like that poison that's in the air, that compound that's in the air. So basically, and now it's altering them because it was made to kill vampires, but it also has adverse reactions against humans. And I think all those who've been changed like them, it's having an adverse reaction on. Obviously, we saw last season, neither Julius nor Axel could heal, so their healing factor is like heavily reduced. So it's like, oh, they're kind of more human now. I would assume it still would make it so that walkers and stuff like that, I said walkers, geez, this isn't Walking Dead, that day walkers and just vampires in general would still not want their blood. I think it still would be a deterrent about eating. I mean, they still would want to kill you and everything, but you wouldn't have that strong healing factor, which they kind of like, yeah, it's sad because it's like, man, had this for a couple seasons, it's going now, so that sucks. But Doc talks about the fact is she was sent here to work on a project by Hansen, but the fact is the main people there rushed things, and when they got attacked, they panicked and used it, and now it's like in the air. And it's like, once again, we don't know what the full effect of what it does to humans. We see what it does to vampires. It killed most of the vampires there, but it's like she said, like 95%, but like 5% mutated. So once again, it's so interesting because it's like one mutation after another. Because first it's like, oh, the day walker's mutation, and now we've got this potentially going forward, and what that means in the grand scheme of things. Because this isn't just going to affect vampires. This is going to affect all our heroes, like everyone that's ever been a vampire before, now human again. It's going to have adverse reactions for them as well, and it's going to be interesting. Well, also, what this looks like going forward for just like regular humans, because once again, everyone that we've seen right now, we've kind of met, like Axel, Julius, and Doc are abnormal humans, so they're like in a very special case. So Doc, because Doc never got bitten by a daywalker, did she? So I don't think she ever did she? So like I don't know what that'll. I don't know. So like she might be a little less abnormal than like Julius and Axel. They're in that special. Were they ever bitten by walkers? I think they were. Regardless, tangents and all that aside, I feel like I'm misremembering some stuff. But obviously Doc is trying to help Julius, and it's just kind of like a thing of like, oh, you got me again with the needle, Doc. She's like, well, it was either that or leave you to die, buddy. And it's like, she's like, she talks about like, I heard from Axel like, you didn't give up on me, and it's like, looks like you didn't give up on me either, Doc. I'm like, yeah, buddies, yeah. It's so cool. I like this budding friendship that they've had grow like over the course of the series. But I also love like obviously like because Axel wants to get out of there, but for Doc, it's like, no, getting out of here is going to be too dangerous. Like, we got that stuff out there, plus we got those vampires, so, like, how do we counteract with that? But it's like, Doc kind of wants to just stay there. Because for Doc, she tried to do everything she could. Like, and I don't think she's lying either, because part of me was wondering, like, are we going to get a reveal or something? But it's like, nah, Doc's not the same person she was. She ain't going to, like, people being out there and, like, lock them out. It's like, for her, it's like, that's why there's so many dead bodies in there, because she tried to bring them in to, like, help them. But over the time, like, her patients ended up dying. So she's the only one that survived. I think it's very befitting, considering, like, everything that they've been through. Like, it makes sense that Doc would be the only one that ended up surviving. They've been, as a core group, when you think about the beginning to where we are now, it's like they've been through a hell of a ride, so which kind of plays in a little bit into the theme of the episode. But regardless, Axel tells her about Jolene, that where she is and everything, so that's kind of an extra motivator for Doc, like, oh, gotta get out of here, I gotta find Jolene. But what I thought was interesting is, like, we first had that vampire, like, ripping off that other vampire's arm. I was like, what the hell is that about? It's like, it seemed like you knocked out a camera. I was like, and then later on, it's like, oh, no, they can't fit in the vent. And I was like, okay, so that's what that was about. And we see later on that vampire literally only has one arm. Her other arm, and her legs were ripped off so she'd fit inside the vent. Obviously the other, and also, like, she has access. She still opens the door for, like, that main dude who ended up being like, oh, yeah. And, I love Doc being like, oh, yeah, that's the asshole who started all this. Like, he's the one that put us in this mess in the first place. And there he is. So obviously they try to cut his head off, but wasn't as Doc says it wasn't that easy. I don't know if she has much she hasn't had much experience like chopping off vampires' heads. So I was like, of course she probably was expecting it to be a little bit more of a smooth, clean cut. It's like it wasn't. If you don't have enough practice with it, it got stuck in his neck. It's easy. At the same time, you had like the other vampire going after Julius, but he's kind of strapped down to the gurney. So I was like, what can he do? But Doc locks herself and Axel in that room, and it's like now that dude's pumping like CO2 in there, and it's like, all right, you know what? For Axel was going to sacrifice himself, but Doc was like, no. The world needs you more, because he was like, the world needs you more than me. But she was like, no, they need you more than me. She's like, just tell Jolene, just tell her she was about to sacrifice her. But lucky your boy Julius came through with the bullet and everything. It's like, yeah. Because she's experimenting on the bullets that were happening, that they were trying to do in Denver. Well, it was the repellent that she modified to kind of use on the bullets, and obviously that didn't work. But now we see like, oh no, it definitely works. So once again, we're going to be dealing with an even more new breed of vampires. I'm like, are they still just going to be daywalkers, or are they going to be like daywalkers 2.0? Because the ones that survived are going to be extra vicious and nasty, because we've seen like, oh, it's hard enough taking down a daywalker. Now it just got even harder, because once again, yay, black tech screwing stuff up and the world having to suffer the ramifications for it. Yeah. But I mean, to be fair, maybe this might play... I think it's interesting, because like this could play a role in wiping out vampirism in its own right. So, granted, it comes with too many drawbacks, but, it might play a role in everything. So, obviously, everyone's getting locked and loaded. Doc gives them like essentially an enhancement. It's like it kind of compensates. It'll give you a little bit of a healing boost, give you some adrenaline, give you superhuman strength. Do not use too much of it, or your heart will explode. Which I'm foreshadowing is going to be a situation where Julius is like, gotta go full throttle, gotta go give this 110% and potentially sacrificing himself. But it's kind of compensating for the fact is that their healing factor has been diminished. I don't know if there's any recovering that, because I guess like that stuff in the air, like that, what they were working on, it's still in their system, and there's no getting it out of there. Kind of like how, why their blood tastes nasty. It's like that stayed in their system. Like maybe this is kind of applying in that same fashion. So because we saw at the end of the episode, Axel still kind of hurt, like the wound on his face, but also like his arm got hurt. So that's maybe it's like, all right, get a little drop so we can heal up a little bit, so we can be good. It's supposed to be an emergency situation. So, but the way that Doc was explaining it, well, at least the way the conversation kind of implies, I guess, I mean, to be fair, this is kind of like we're going more like virus, like airborne virus type of thing, where it's like, I guess because of the wind and everything, like who knows how much they released in the air, like, so it's probably, I guess they're kind of implying like because of the wind and everything, like it's spread across, like there was that much, and with the wind kind of blowing in directions, it's in the air. So once again, it's going to start affecting a lot of people, even to the point later on, skipping around a little bit, but like Axel warning Violet, like be careful. It's also interesting too, because I think it's also one of those things of like, yeah, there's like everything going on in the actual real world and how it's affecting the production. Let's kind of fold it into the story to a certain extent. To be fair, the show has always been kind of a bit about a virus, because they've always handled the vampirism. Yes, it's a mystical thing, but they've always treated it like a science fictional thing, like a virus anyway. So it's not that big of a stretch, but it still can flow into it without it being like too out there, because it's like, yeah, vampirism has always been treated like a virus in this. But obviously, Doc made as many bullets. It's like, but obviously there's only so many, so use them sparingly. And it's like, oh, you're not coming? And she's like, no, now, this is the end of the road with me. Now that you told me where Jolene is. And I was like, oh, so we only get, this is our last episode. We get probably, this is, I'm assuming it's implying like we get one, this is our first and last episode with Doc. In the sense of like, yeah, this is our first episode since she got shipped off in season 4. And it's like, yeah, this is our last episode with her. To be fair, it's like, yeah, like Phil had his send-off last season when he left with his son and his wife. So I think we got a similar thing. And obviously for her and Axel, it's like, yeah, the good and the bad, like all that we've been through, all the, because she was even telling Axel, it's like, there's no way we're going to die here today. After everything we've been through, this is not where we die, And then even her moment between her and Julius, and it's like, nacho cheese, and it's like, nacho cheese, the feels, I remember, fighting over and making that joke about nacho cheese. He's like, nacho cheese, it's just like, the good times, man. It's like, man, that feels like forever ago, because it was a couple years ago. Obviously, it was a couple seasons back, because that was definitely season 2, I believe. So it's like, man, feels like a different lifetime, dude. It's like, no! But also, it's like, I'm glad, because obviously at the end of it all, we do see, Doc made her way to Loveland, and she's reunited with Jolene. You're like, yeah! It's like, I think they managed to get everyone out of Loveland, and now it's a situation of like, well, now that that's taken care of, it's like, Jolene was kind of like, I think for her, like, maybe she was kind of hoping to find some means of finding Doc. But now, Doc found her way to her. It's like, I've never lost you. Obviously, I've been trying to find my way back to you. So where they're going next, who knows? Maybe somehow whatever world awaits them kind of like Phil. Like maybe maybe they'll run into each other out there, while like this fight is coming to an end. I was almost hoping, sadly we don't get it, I was almost hoping like Doc would have gotten to meet Jack and Violet. I would have loved that. It would have been nice to it would have been nice, but it's like, dude. The only OG left now at this point in time, like from the original groups are, well, she's under different circumstances right now, but it's Vanessa and Axel, because everyone else is like, oh yeah, like the last one, because obviously Sam died last season, and now Doc is going. I mean, I guess you can make the argument to a certain extent, like Phil was kind of there at the beginning of the series, granted, but still, it's just kind of, it's a beautiful thing to know that Jolene and Doc are together, but it's also sad that they're leaving the story too, I think, but it's like, at least they're getting there happily ever after. It's apocalyptic world, so you're like, well, I think they'll be able to look after each other and everything's going to be okay. You want to believe that, so. Then on the other side of things, since I brought up the whole Violet situation, like her and Ivory are getting tortured because it's like, oh, you're traitors. Why'd you try to kill the president? I'm literally telling you, okay, yes, the president's a vampire. Like, well, not just any vampire, the ultimate vampire called the Dark One. And it's like, but then where's the president's body? We've been all over this place, haven't found it. Makes you wonder, why didn't they find the president's body? I mean, obviously after Bathory did what she did, like, Avery's body would, well, they did ultimately end up finding Avery's body, so maybe like the president's body was just that well hidden, or maybe the Dark One was like, you know what, I'm just going to devour this entire thing. Maybe that's kind of what that is. Regardless, it also gave me an answer to something I was curious about, because I was like, because I guess it might, like, I think I brought this up last episode, but I think in my head I was thinking like she came back in Jack's body. It's like, no, she came back in the form of Jack. She was still in her body. It's still her body and everything. She just made herself look like Jack and now looking like the president. So that's because that's what I was wondering. I was like, because like. I think I cleared that up, but that was like a misconception I think I had maybe in the first, second, or third episode. Like, I don't remember. I definitely remember kind of thinking like, oh, is that actually her body? It's like, no, she's actually time traveling. It's actually her body, because I was wondering if it's like technically like a copy or something. Tangents and all that aside, I like I said, I vaguely remember saying something of that nature. I don't remember if I corrected myself on that. This episode, I figured I might as well like kind of correct that notion I had. But regardless, trying to do their best to convince, like, which also that actress, sci-fi wise, she was in that show Ghost Wars, but she was also in Continuum. Wasn't her character's name Garza? I believe that's the same actress. She was like the mayor in the show Ghost Wars. It's such a shame that show was so short-lived, because I actually really enjoyed it. Regardless, tangents aside, I also need to go back and watch Continuum, because I never watched the final season. There's a lot of stuff I did that I need to go back to. Like, I never watched the final season a lot. It's like, because I don't like stuff ending. That's also always my biggest issue. I mean, well, here we are. I've gotten better about it, but back then I wasn't always good at upkeeping with stuff. Regardless, God, I'm going on these huge tangents. I do apologize. But circling back to it, Violet and Ivory are trying to find a way out of these circumstances, especially because orders came in to execute them, which even the dude who's Principal Weatherby from Riverdale, so once again, just comic book stuff, connections and stuff like that, but it's like, oh, wait, you want to kill Violet? She can cure vampirism. It's like, oh, it was a hoax. Vampires in disguise. Kill them. And it's like, okay, so Jack tried to like choke out a guy who ended up being a black tech dude. Maybe they're a little bit more like, maybe. But obviously the army coming in being like, oh, you know, all the people who were in the know, in particular that high-ranking dude, died last season. So like anyone who knew like the real situation is gone. So there's no one to like confirm like their story and everything. But they luckily managed to get away and was able to confirm it themselves by being like, hey, my dad had some backups. They erased the tapes. Well, here are the backups. Oh, and it proves like, oh, the president really is dead. So, but also, Violet has the amulet. Once again, this time travel stuff is so interesting because it's not necessarily like, oh, this created like a timeline B. We're still living in timeline A. It's just like the changes are happening and even people being like, whoa. I think that's so interesting. Once again, like different things have different time travel rules. To be fair, this is like a very special case of time travel, so I think it's a little bit different. But it's like, so we're not in a timeline B where like, oh, everything's it. Because even Violet's like, why does this look different? So because even the Dark One sensing it, I guess makes sense. But it was like, once again, it kind of showcases like, no, the past has been changed. Which is also interesting because it's not even in-game rules of time travel, because your time travel, you create an alternate timeline, you don't affect the timeline you're from, you know. So that, once again, it's kind of a special case of time travel. I think that's so interesting. But essentially, it's like Violet being like, "What's up with that?" And then she opens up and like lets out some of the power, and it's like, "Oh, shouldn't have done that." But to be fair, you only let a tiny bit out, you know. But still, at first I was like, what the hell is that tiny bit going to do? And we get an answer to that later on. But now they've got to find a way to track down the Dark One and finish this. Because, well, they do. Because it's like, how did a fraction of her power get here? It's like, yep, your sister. Which, like, you know, what's her circumstances? Last time we saw her, she was trapped in the past. Once again, is she going to, like... Because I don't know if they made that clear whether or not, because of their circumstances, do they... they age... But, you know, so that's why I'm wondering, but I'm wondering, like, once the Van Helsing, like, complicated situation that they have being, like, part vampire, part Van Helsing kicked in, did that stop their aging process? Like, no, they are still human, so I think, because my argument was saying, like, even though, like, yeah, they've had this in them since they were kids, I'm still wondering if it took it activating to really, make it so that maybe they don't age, but it's like, no, they are still very human, more so than other. But that's why I'm also like, they're also, that's why I'm like, I don't know if they like, they will live as long as, like, will they live longer than humans, or do they still have a human, lifespan or whatever. Regardless. So that's interesting, like, obviously, like, you know, moving pieces all over the place. And then we have, like, you know, at the White House, you know, the conversations between, quote unquote, Avery and the president about how handling things going forward. And obviously, the president wanting him to make a speech to the public. Even the guy was like, you know, the fact is, like, you know, moments like this define your presidency. What will your presidency be kind of? What will this say about your presidency? It's like, sadly, it's not really your president. So, when it's all said and done, she gives a speech being like, yeah, that was a hoax, but there's vampires and boxes, and they can look human. Your friends, your neighbors. So I was like, oh, so you're basically turning in like the last of humanity against each other, because that suspicion and paranoia. It's like, oh, they'll kind of like. I was wondering whether or not she was kind of setting it up a thing of like, oh, like they'll kind of be their own undoing, like they kind of kill each other off to a certain extent. But it's like, I guess it's just like knowing that they're afraid and panicking. And it's like, give me that fear, give me that panic. So tasty, so good. Really quickly, going back to that point, because now I'm thinking about it, it's like, man, that's so interesting, because that means because this time travel stuff has got me. Because I've been, you know, because if you don't know, like, time travel, like, and stuff like that, alternate timelines and stuff, that's my jam. Like, if you've watched my most recent reviews of Debris, I'm nerding out about that type of shit. Because the most recent episodes kind of dealt with that. But the reason why I'm talking about it again, because it's also like, because I was also wondering, like, oh, it's an alternate timeline. Because I was also wondering, like, oh, like, the Bathory, not just the Bathory thing, but also the Michaela thing. But it's like, I was wondering, like, if it's like, oh, how would you not know Jack? It's because, once again, like, what happened there, it shifted this history, it shifted this world on it feels more, it's a more supernatural mystical time travel rather than like a science fictional time travel, which I know it's a weird debate. Once again, this show's always done that interesting thing I've talked about at the beginning, like how it's always done that, like balance like the science fictional approach to kind of like vampirism and, like I said, treating it more like zombieism, but also like incorporating the mysticism of it as well as the show has progressed. Like, because it starts off a very like I said, zombie-ish show at the beginning, and then we heavily get into like the mysticism as the show has gone on. But it's just interesting to think about, just because it's like you would think they would, like, because they know Jack, they've seen her face, so it's like, oh, that kind. But it's like, once again, it didn't affect this timeline in that regard. What changes she made got changed, but everything else stayed the same. A lot of that timeline stayed the same anyway, so I'm wondering, like, maybe that's supposed to mean, I don't know. It's just interesting because it's showcasing, like, even though Jack made those changes, the fact is it's kind of implying like they didn't. I mean, not unless they're setting up like there is a timeline B. Like, it's a weird circumstance because it showcases that like its time travel didn't stick in the sense that it didn't completely change this timeline. Like, because they recognize there's differences, and when it comes to timeline shifting like that, you're not supposed to notice the difference because it's like, oh, you live different lives. The fact is, Violet's like, the blood in this vial is different. It's like, you should know that if this was an alternate timeline, you know? So it's great. Like I said, it's more of a mysticism time travel just because it was a more magical situation that led to the time travel. So I guess that's why. It's fascinating. It just like sends your mind off on like, oh, what the implications of that to me, because there kind of are no implications because that means everything else stayed the same. Nothing changed in this particular time frame, just those small aspects. But my point also being like, is that supposed to mean that Jack always time traveled to kind of create these circumstances? So maybe that, because that's also like, oh, like the first Van Helsing being Jack, being Dalabor's child and everything. It's like, is it just that specific situation, or is it supposed to imply she's always been like, this is all the Ouroboros thing of a snake eating its tail? Like, this is the loop that always happened. Once again, time travel, I get, like I said, I nerd out about that stuff. I start thinking too heavily about it. Regardless, I went on a huge tangent. I do apologize. But when it comes to Bathory and Dracula, it's like the fear and everything. So good. But it's like, it didn't satiate her. She thought it would restore her vigor, but it's like, I'm still going to need my power back. I thought it made me feel better. It doesn't compensate for the fact is I've got a large chunk of my power gone. But then, Bathory's like, oh, the fact is, you'll rule everything. The Van Helsings, I'll bring you their head and restore your power. And it's like, oh, your loyalty, Bathory. But the fact is, your methods are ineffective. And then immediately Bathory, it's sad because it's like, Bathory's so dedicated to her. Like, she always wants to be the number one. To be fair, at this point in time, you are number one because you're the only one left. So it kind of worked out. But also, like, seeing her like that, now knowing Bathory's backstory, you're like, oh, you actually feel really sympathetic to her. I think it's kind of interesting. They made sure to not, like, at least Hansen and Bathory feel sympathetic towards because we got their backstories. Michaela was already an evil vampire, so, like, they made sure to make it, no. Michaela sucks. Don't feel any sympathy for her, but Bathory you do. But then Bathory has a vision of her own death, and it was like, oh, what'd you see? It's like, your victory over, countless corpses. Together? And it's like, yeah, together. And then she goes to read the cards, and then it's like, oh, her death will come from, and she sees the Fool, the Bringer Chaos. Once again, I appreciate the Arcana just because of, like, Persona. That kind of makes you get nerdy about the Arcana, regardless. But then her cards start shifting, because it's like, oh, they all start turning into Jack, Violet, Vanessa, that basically their course has been set. This is their end, Sadly, Bathory doesn't get. I don't think Bathory's going to be able to go. Not less. I'm curious because I was also wondering, like, is that kind of implying that they're going to kill Bathory, or are we going to find out that the Dark One is, because Bathory proved to be not useful, and it's like, oh, I'm gonna get rid of you. Or do they end up, because like the way she looks like herself. But to be fair, we now know because of Jack, like, she was blinded and what those marks are for. So that could have been her turned back into a human, and maybe she didn't just recover. Or, because maybe Jack's able to convince Bathory of who she was before and kind of bring her back into the fight on the good side, and that's how she died. Like, maybe she kind of dies a hero. Like, she didn't want to live this life anyway. She wanted to die. She didn't want to become what she became. So maybe that's all coming full circle in that regard. Well, ultimately, you have to see. But then you also have the dark one. I was like, okay, so where's that power? What's that gun? Oh, cool. The power found its way back to her. So she manifested. She bleeds, summons up a dark power. I'm like, what is that going to be that she's like letting loose in the world? Like, find me the rest of my power, go. And I'm like, what is that going to turn into? I'm so fascinated to know, like, what is that power in itself going to manifest itself as? We'll ultimately have to wait and see, but I'm really interested to see where all this ultimately ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. So the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.